Throughout the Second World War, there were many different concentration camps which would become sites of execution, torture and slaughter on a mass scale. Many of the larger camps had a number of smaller sub-camps, but still inside of these there was a huge amount of death. When the Allies liberated these sites, they came across true horror on Earth, and the corpses were lying everywhere, and what these men saw would stay with them until the day they died. But one of these sub-camps was found close to Neuengamme, which was a camp where over 100,000 prisoners passed through the barbed wire fences. However, around 43,000 would never make it out of the camps alive. One of the sub-camps was known as Wöbbelin, and when the Americans liberated the camp, they came across a site where the SS had exhibited such horror and brutality. Join us today as we look at the executions of Wöbbelin sub-camp, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Wöbbelin was a sub-camp of the Neuengamme complex, and it was found near to the city of Ludwigslust. It served the main camp of Neuengamme, and this would be a place where, as the Second World War progressed, it became very overcrowded. The death rates inside of the camp were large, and a crematorium would be constructed to deal with the death, but following the Battle of Stalingrad, there were many Soviet POWs who were sent to the camp. But there were many sub-camps that served Neuengamme, and there were dozens of these which had different roles in the war industries. There was a very small camp situated nearby, and this opened in September 1944 and was filled with American prisoners of war who would then go on to build Wöbbelin. However, on the 12th of February 1945, these prisoners were sent to go and build a larger site, which became the Wöbbelin concentration camp. At its peak, the camp would hold around 5,000 prisoners, and most of these would suffer from the tragic living conditions and the starvation that was at the site. An SS doctor would claim, after the war, that 648 people were held at the camp until the end of March 1945, and in mid-April, many transports from sub-camps were from Neuengamme and Ravensbrück, and they arrived at Wöbbelin. At this time in the Second World War, there were many death marches which came from different camps, and this was done to keep prisoners out of the hands of the enemies. The Nazis did not want a single concentration camp prisoner telling the truth of what was happening inside of the concentration camps, and many would be slaughtered en route to their final destination. But Wöbbelin became a place where over 4,000 people were transferred to. This put a great strain on the camp's resources, and in the final days of the conflict, the site would become abandoned by the guards. On the 2nd of May 1945, the US 8th Infantry and the 82nd Airborne came across the camp, and what they found was truly shocking. There was little food and water, and many of the prisoners had resorted to the lowest of the lows to try and just survive. They had cannibalised some of the inmates who had died in the days before liberation, and lying around the camp were many dead bodies, with prisoners just lying where they fell still. There was little to no effort to clean up the camp, and within the large barbed wire fences it was truly hell. The overcrowding and deportations made things worse, and the American forces found around 1,000 prisoners dead inside of Wöbbelin. One man who liberated the camp said, "All of what I saw was through the sight of my gun. We saw a lot of people killed in our own company, and also we'd killed a lot of Germans. Some skinny looking guys in bad shape were peering back at us. I was not prepared mentally to deal with the horror of the camp." After entering the camp, the liberators went towards some barrack buildings, and they found what they described as 200 twisted nude bodies of skin and bone, piled 4 to 5 feet high. Individual forms were almost indistinguishable. There could not have been a body more of 60 pounds, said a liberator. The same man wrote, "Most were lying on the dirt floor, or propped against the sides of the building, and they were too weak to get up. With sunken eyes and skin taut, they looked like skeletons." Food was brought in by the Americans to help those who were very close to death and who were clinging on to life. Also, medical care arrived inside of Wöbbelin to help save as many lives of the inmates as possible. Shocked at what they found and also incredibly disgusted, the American soldiers then went into the local town and ordered all of the people there to help bury those who had died. Many could not believe their eyes, and the citizens of Ludwigslust, when they entered the camp, were mostly disgusted with what had happened at the hands of the Nazis and the local SS. But many questioned that they must have known what was happening inside of the camp, and that many of these people chose not to help those who were suffering and starving. 5 days later, there were large-scale funeral services conducted for the inmates who had died. Many of those who attended the ceremonies were captured German officers, hundreds of liberating forces, and also the general public. A US Army chaplain and priest delivered a eulogy and said, "The crimes here committed in the name of the German people and by their acquiescence were minor compared to those found in concentration camps elsewhere in Germany. Here there were no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia and France were simply allowed to starve to death. Within 4 miles of your comfortable homes, 4,000 men were forced to live like animals, deprived even of food you would give to your dogs. In 3 weeks, 1,000 of these men were starved to death. 800 of them were buried in pits in the nearby woods. These 200 who lie before us in these graves were found piled 4 and 5 feet high in one building and lying with the sick and dying in other buildings. Each of the bodies were buried in a parachute silk. They were then given a semi-decent burial." One liberator would write, "We stood there and we realised that it was to destroy the monstrosity that the Nazis had created, and they realised that their job was now to bring the war to an end and destroy the government and army of those who had inflicted such suffering and horror inside of the concentration camps." The 82nd Airborne Division would later move on after a few days, but many of their soldiers had been scarred by what they saw. In accordance with the US Army policy dictated by Dwight Eisenhower, the Americans would state that all atrocity victims are to be buried in a public place, and they then mark the graves of those victims with stars of David on the Jewish graves and crosses on the Christian ones. Many of the victims of Wöbbelin were those who had been sent there in the final days of the Second World War from many different camps, and a number of them were also young women who were sent from Ravensbrück. It was a camp where the Nazis just intended to starve everyone inside, and they had absolutely no intention of providing food or supplies. The guards fled and ran for their lives to evade justice and a war crimes trial, and there were very few people, if any, who worked at the camp who were ever brought to trial. Inside the camp, thousands died, with the majority being starved to death, and many of these were then buried nearby in large pits near to the woods. The camp was freed days after Hitler had taken his own life inside of the Führerbunker in Berlin, and despite the curtain beginning to come down on the Second World War in Europe, the crimes of the SS and the Nazis would still remain and would still be discovered. Still today there are many victims of the evil Nazis that lie under the ground, and their true story is yet to be uncovered. But Wöbbelin concentration camp is not the most well known, but it deserves to be more prominent in history books, and what the US Army soldiers found that day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.